They were only supposed to be out for an hour, just a quick morning hike, a chance to breathe before the city swallowed them whole again. But the forest didn't feel quiet that day. It was too still, as if something had paused the entire world, and no one else noticed. Then they heard it. Not a branch snap, not the rustle of leaves, but a scream, a low, guttural, unrelenting scream. Not human, but not entirely animal either. Something desperate, wounded, alone. They stopped, looked at each other. The sound was distant, buried in the thicket beyond the trail. Most people would have walked away, chalked it up to wildlife, turned back. But something in the air gripped them, a pull neither could explain. They followed the sound, pushing through brush, ducking beneath low-hanging branches, heartbeats growing louder with every step. And then it stopped. Total silence, until they saw it. A patch of churned-up soil, blood-streaked leaves, and in the middle, a young bear, motionless. One leg twisted at a grotesque angle, caught in the rusted jaws of a metal trap. His breathing was shallow, his eyes wide with fear. But worst of all, he hadn't even tried to run, because there was nowhere to go. They didn't speak. Not at first, because what words could possibly exist for something like this? For a baby bear no older than a year, still clinging to whatever was left of his strength, bleeding into the forest floor while his eyes begged for a kind of mercy he'd never known. The trap was old, coated in rust and dried blood, but still vicious, designed to clamp down and never let go. A silent weapon left behind by men who would never return, who didn't care what found it. Whether bear or deer or pet or pup, it didn't matter, only that it held. One of them stepped closer, slowly, hands raised like they were approaching something sacred and afraid. The bear didn't growl, he didn't move, he just breathed, shallow and trembling, as if each inhale cost him more than he had left to give. They knew the rules: never interfere with wild animals, never touch, never get involved. But this wasn't the wild. This was something else, something cruel masquerading as nature. And someone, somewhere, had decided that leaving pain behind, in steel and silence, was acceptable. She dropped to her knees beside him, whispered to him like he was already hers. The other ran back for help, cell signal flickering, adrenaline choking logic. Every second felt like a countdown. The bear blinked, not in fear, but in surrender. And still, he didn't try to bite. He didn't try to escape. He simply stayed. Because maybe in that moment, hope was heavier than instinct. Maybe he had been waiting, against every odd, for this exact moment. It took a team, hours, and tools not meant for the forest. It took coaxing, tears, and bloodied gloves. But the trap finally opened, with a sound so sharp and final, it echoed like thunder across the clearing. And the bear, he didn't run. He collapsed, as if the pain had been holding him up this whole time, as if now that it was gone, he could finally let go. They named him Echo, not because he made noise, but because even in silence, he was unforgettable. Not because he roared or fought or displayed some wild majesty that demanded awe, but because he didn't, because he was small, silent, and soft in a world that had been anything but. He became the echo of every unseen animal, every scream that went unheard, every cry that was buried in leaves and dirt and quiet indifference. When the rescuers lifted him into the sling, they expected struggle, but Echo didn't struggle. He trusted, as if even in pain, even after being betrayed by something meant to be his home, he still believed there was good left in the hands reaching for him. At the sanctuary, they cleaned his wounds with care no trap had ever known. He flinched but didn't pull away. When they stitched the jagged tear across his hind leg, he let out one sound, low and shaky, but not angry. It was as if he was apologizing for needing help, as if survival had made him feel like a burden. But over the days that followed, Echo began to breathe differently, not just out of necessity, but out of safety. He began to sleep longer, deeper, curled into himself without trembling. He ate slowly at first, unsure whether the food was truly his or just a dream waiting to vanish. But he learned. With every gentle touch, every calm voice, Every morning he awoke to soft light instead of pain. He learned, and in the quietest of moments, they began to notice something else. Other animals, wounded, frightened, traumatized, gravitated toward him, like something in echo whispered, "You're safe here." He became the still point in a place built for healing, the one who had every reason to lash out, to give up, but didn't. Because Echo had survived more than a trap. He had survived silence. He had survived invisibility. And now, just by existing, he reminded everyone who crossed his path what empathy truly looked like. Not loud, not forceful, not performative. Just present, just unwavering, just real. He wasn't a symbol. He wasn't a story. He was a life that refused to be forgotten. And in doing so, he began rewriting the forest memory. One breath, one blink, one healed scar at a time. He became something more than just a survivor. He became a reason for the volunteers to keep showing up, for donations to keep coming in, for the sanctuary to expand its fences and take in those still hiding in the dark. Echo didn't need to speak. His presence said everything. Children would visit and stand quietly near his enclosure, whispering things they hadn't told anyone else. War veterans, haunted by their own invisible wounds, would sit beside him for hours, not looking at him, but drawing from his calm as if it were medicine. He wasn't trying to inspire, he just was, and that was enough. In time, the trap that had nearly ended him was mounted on the sanctuary wall, not as a trophy, but as a warning, a rusted reminder of what indifference can do and what love must undo. It hung not far from a photo of Echo, taken 1 year after his rescue. In it, his coat had grown thick and soft again. His eyes no longer darted in fear, and the once broken leg now held his weight firmly as he stood near the fence, watching a new arrival be carried in, trembling. And he didn't turn away. Echo walked slowly, carefully toward the frightened cub. No growl, no sound, just presence, just breathe. He lowered his head, touched noses briefly, and then settled a few feet away. Close, but not too close, giving space, offering trust, the way it had once been offered to him. And in that moment, the cycle that had tried to end him broke just a little more. Because healing, it turns out, isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like a scarred bear standing quietly in the morning light, reminding the world that even what's been discarded can become a beginning. Even silence, when met with care, can turn into a voice that echoes farther than we ever imagined. Because sometimes the ones who were never meant to survive become the ones who teach us how to live. Echo didn't need a spotlight, a campaign, or a speech. He needed space, safety, and time. And in that quiet gift, he bloomed. He began to nap with his back exposed, no longer afraid of what might come from behind. He let the wind ruffle his fur without flinching. He began to roll in the grass, not as play at first, but as a question. Am I really allowed to feel this? And as days passed, that question slowly became a statement. I'm still here. Volunteers learned to wait with him, not for him, to match his pace instead of rushing his healing. They stopped measuring his progress by milestones and instead celebrated his stillness, his presence, his gaze that no longer trembled at movement. Echo had become more than a bear with a past. He had become a keeper of space, a soft place in a hard world, a quiet revolution. And perhaps the most extraordinary part wasn't his survival, but the way he began to extend peace to others. Birds would land near him. New arrivals would find themselves sleeping just outside his den, drawn by some unseen signal that said, "This place is different. You're not alone anymore." And truly they weren't. Because Echo, without knowing it, had turned trauma into shelter, pain into purpose. And in doing so, he gave others permission to exist beyond their wounds. He was never trying to change the world, but he did. Not through protest or defiance, but through presence. Through simply being a reminder that life doesn't end when the pain begins. That even the most broken beings, given enough care and time, can rewrite the ending they were handed. Echo became that living contradiction. A body once torn by steel, now softened by trust. A life once discarded, now quietly lighting the way for others. And maybe the world didn't notice the day he stopped flinching at footsteps or the day he slept through a thunderstorm. But those who had been watching, those who had held their breath with him, noticed everything. He started walking a little farther from his den each morning, tracing paths he once avoided. He stood longer in open spaces. He even began to vocalize, not in fear, but in low, rumbling calls that carried through the trees. And it was then that something incredible began to happen. Other bears, newer rescues, began to mimic him. One by one, they started stepping into the light, drawn by the rhythm of Echo's resilience. He didn't lead them. He invited them, just by being. And perhaps that's what healing really looks like. Not a clean slate, but a shared one. Not forgetting what hurt, but remembering in a way that lets others feel safe to remember too. Echo's scars didn't vanish. They became maps for others to follow. They showed where the pain had been and where it no longer ruled. Because in the end, Echo didn't survive to be pitied. He survived to become proof. Proof that cruelty doesn't have to be the final word. That somewhere beyond the fence lines of pain, life can be rebuilt. Not in grand gestures, but in slow mornings. In trust earned breath by breath. And in the quiet revolution of simply staying, Echo gave others something no speech or headline ever could. Permission. Permission to take their time. To not be okay. To not rush healing just because the world keeps spinning. The forest around him changed, not in appearance, but in energy. Where once there had been only shadows and silence, now there was softness, slowness, safety. And in that stillness, a kind of magic took root. Not the kind made of illusions, but of truth. The kind that whispers, "You matter, even when you do nothing at all." One morning, a cub newly rescued from a roadside attraction refused to eat. He had curled up in the corner of the enclosure, eyes wide, trembling. No one could coax him out. But then Echo walked over. He didn't nudge him, didn't push. He simply lay down nearby, back turned, breathing slow and deep. Minutes passed, then an hour, then two. And when the cub finally inched forward and rested beside him, no one spoke, no one moved, because something sacred had just occurred, something that could never be taught, only felt. Echo had become a sanctuary, not just in body but in spirit. He was no longer the bear who had been chained, the animal discarded. He was the one others trusted first, the one who could break tension just by being near. Volunteers began to call him the heartbeat of the forest, and maybe they were right, because when Echo walked, others followed. Not out of duty, but out of knowing they would not be alone. In a world obsessed with noise, with doing and fixing and saving, Echo reminded them that there is radical power in simply witnessing, in holding space, in standing still so someone else can start to move. He didn't need a second chance to be whole. He just needed someone to believe the first one wasn't wasted, because that's all any of them really need. Someone to believe they were never meant to be broken in the first place. Not a project to fix, not a burden to pity, just a life interrupted. And if given even a sliver of care, a single day without fear, they might show us how deeply they remember softness, even after everything. Echo wasn't extraordinary because he survived cruelty. Thousands do. What made him unforgettable was how he carried that survival, not like a shield, but like a seed, something he planted gently in others, day after day, with no demand for thanks, just quiet presence, just the rhythm of breath next to breath. And slowly the sanctuary transformed, not with grand announcements, but with small sacred shifts. A door left open a little longer, a bowl nudged closer by a trembling paw, a volunteer realizing that silence didn't mean distrust, it just meant waiting to be sure. Echo became the reason they learned to wait, to listen, to move slower. And in doing so, the place became more than a rescue. It became a home, a place where pain wasn't hidden, but held, not erased, but honored. Because of one bear who stayed, because of one soul who didn't run, because sometimes the loudest healing doesn't come from being saved, it comes from being believed in. Because when someone finally believes in you, not the version they hope you'll become, but the raw, aching truth of who you are, something shifts inside, slowly, subtly, like the first thaw of winter. Echo didn't chase it. He didn't even try. He just lived in a way that made others feel safe enough to soften. His story wasn't told through headlines or viral photos. It was told in the small, sacred moments. A trembling paw that stopped shaking when he approached. A baby who slept through the night for the first time curled beside him. A caregiver who, after months of distance, finally sat on the ground and let herself cry beside his enclosure. Because somehow, his silence gave her permission. And still, Echo asked for nothing. There was never a point where he paid back his rescue. He didn't need to. His value wasn't tied to redemption. It wasn't about becoming something else. It was about becoming himself, unhidden. That was his offering. That was his miracle. Not in his strength, but in his softness. Not in his defiance, but in his presence. He reminded them that survival wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something deeper, something slower, something truer. When new rescues came, fragile, fractured, frozen from what they had endured, Echo never forced connection. He would wait, sometimes days, sometimes weeks, just lying nearby, letting his heartbeat do the talking. Letting them know, in every quiet breath, you're not alone anymore. And over time, something remarkable happened. The sanctuary no longer revolved around what had been done to them, but what could begin because they were still here. They weren't survivors out of necessity. They were guides, healers. Echo, in particular, had become a kind of guardian, not by command, but by choice. And others followed, not because he was dominant, but because he was consistent, gentle, grounded. He had become the kind of leader the world needs more of, quiet, steady, rooted in compassion. And somehow, through all of it, his past didn't define him. His presence did. Because presence, true, unwavering presence, can be more healing than any medicine. Echo didn't speak. He didn't need to. His body carried stories that words couldn't hold, scars that didn't ask for sympathy, eyes that didn't search for pity, just presence. He walked among the others like a reminder that pain wasn't a life sentence, that calm could exist even after chaos, that you could be touched without flinching, seen without fear. And that presence began to change everything. The way caregivers entered enclosures shifted. They moved slower, softer. They paused longer before reaching out. The animals followed suit. Fewer fights, fewer stress cries, more rest, more watching. Echo had redefined safety, not as the absence of harm, but as the presence of trust. Real, earned, wordless trust. Even the most hardened rescues, those who paced for hours or cowered in corners, began to inch forward, drawn not by food or treats, but by the gravity of his stillness. One by one, they'd find their way to where he lay, curl beside him, and breathe. Sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. Sometimes it was the first sleep they'd had in days. And still Echo asked for nothing, because that was never the point. The point was, he stayed. He showed up day after day with no expectation of reward. He taught them, and the people around him, that healing doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it's quiet, messy, slow, but real. That love doesn't always rescue, it remains. Even when it's hard, even when it hurts, even when the world said they weren't worth it. And through that constancy, that refusal to turn away, Echo became more than a survivor. He became a mirror. He reflected back the truth that every soul in that place was still whole, still worthy despite everything. Especially because of everything. Because what breaks us doesn't erase us. It marks us, yes, shapes us. But it also teaches us to feel the world differently, to notice the warmth of sunlight on skin, the weight of another body nearby, the quiet miracle of being allowed to stay. Echo didn't teach them to forget what had happened. He showed them how to carry it differently, with dignity, with grace, with a kind of strength that didn't need to roar to be heard. His wounds never fully disappeared. They didn't need to. They became the language he spoke in silence. They became proof that survival could be beautiful, not despite the pain, but through it. And the animals around him, some young, some old, all aching in their own ways, began to carry themselves differently too. They no longer flinched at touch. They met human hands not with fear, but with cautious hope. They began to play, to rest, to trust. And the people, especially the people, began to change as well. Volunteers who had arrived thinking they were there to fix broken creatures soon learned they were the ones being transformed. Echo reminded them that the work wasn't about erasing trauma or forcing recovery. It was about presence, patience, staying, about bearing witness to the ones who had already survived the unthinkable and saying, "You don't have to earn your place anymore. You already belong." And in that, he became the quiet center of the sanctuary. Not its loudest voice, but its truest one. The heartbeat others learned to follow. The reason they waited a little longer, listened a little deeper, loved a little more gently. He had come from a place where cruelty was casual and life was disposable. But here, he mattered. Every breath he took mattered. Every step he chose to take, every moment he chose to stay, was a declaration. I am still here, and that is enough. Because Echo didn't just survive, he showed them how. They never forgot the day Echo closed his eyes for the last time. It wasn't dramatic. There were no cries, no desperate struggles, just stillness, like a sigh returning to the earth. But the space he left behind wasn't empty. It was full of all the lives he had touched, the ones he had coaxed back from the edge, the ones who had learned to lie beside another without fear, the ones who found their voice again because he never needed to speak to be heard. His legacy wasn't carved in stone or written in records. It walked on four paws. It curled beside others at dusk. It flickered in the eyes of animals who dared to hope again. It whispered in the quiet decisions made by humans who now knew better. It lingered in the silence that held weight, not absence. Because Echo didn't just stay. He left something behind, a blueprint for compassion, a model for healing that didn't require perfection, just patience, and a question that would echo long after his name faded. If he could do all that just by staying, what's stopping us? If Echo's story moved you, don't let it end here. Share it, speak up, support sanctuaries, adopt, don't shop. Because the quietest lives often leave the loudest legacies, and yours might be the one that helps another animal feel safe enough to begin again.